So we're in a moment of doubt as far as this is concerned, where it's going to go. You're in doubt, but you're not the only one who's in doubt. So are the European governments on the one hand, and the governments of the global south on the other hand. So at least for as long as this uncertainty goes, what is the near future, or what could be the near future of the Wall Street consensus in Europe on the one hand, in the global south to the extent that we can generalize on the other hand?
I would say in my most pessimistic reading is that the Wall Street consensus will thrive because it thrives on crisis conditions in which governments are faced with shrinking fiscal resources for addressing the crisis one way or another, and because the crisis conditions require some kind of response, then the response is private finance. So as long as these crisis conditions, for example, increasing investment in welfare, if you look at in warfare, if you look at the European Union, the way in which it frames the current geopolitical moment and challenge is welfare for warfare, as in we will have to reduce our welfare spending, increase our warfare spending, increase our military budgets. That's the only way forward. And part of the increase in military budgets is going to come through the magic of de-risking, that is to mobilize private capital into warfare. I think that's a kind of more complicated political proposition, but the logic, the political instinct is still this one. It's not to say, well, the ECB should be buying more government bonds, or we need a different kind of institutional arrangement. The logic is still we need to work within the constraints of the neoliberal institutional framework. So that always gives the answer private finance. So I'm not entirely optimistic, even if I look at the Labour government in the United Kingdom that got a large majority that would allow it to do more transformative politics if it chose to. It still thinks that it will get BlackRock to rebuild Britain. It thought that before Trump was elected. I think it continues to think that. So I can't see that that's the way in which critical macrofinance sets up the conditions for existence of the Wall Street consensus, is that for the near term, the alternative has to come from changing the institutional architecture of the state in terms of macroeconomic policy making. And until that changes, and that's why I said that maybe Trump will be able to break that, and whether that's a politically desirable issue is a separate question. But on the logic of institutional transformation, we are not there yet. We're not there, and I think every moment of transformative intentions, like the Liz Truss government had also transformative intentions. Donald Trump's transformative tariffs, they have been read as validations of you can't work against private finance. You have to work with it, and to work with it, you have to go back to the logic of the Wall Street consensus.
At the same time, I mean, pushing you a little bit on this, at the same time, the uncertainty created by the Trump administration, even in the wake of suspending the tariffs for 90 days, is such that it, for the great pleasure, anticipatory pleasure of China, among others, there is a tendency in Europe, and even more in the South, of saying, well, maybe we should try to dissociate as much as we can from America, which means not only the American government, but which means the entire web of private finance that is attached to America. So how does that could affect their allegiance to the Wall Street consensus?
Okay, I have to confess that I have not seen any government wanting, kind of thinking that, or publicly stating that a let's call it, remember that European governments also use de-risking for describing a new relationship with China after 2020, 2021, in which there will be less kind of vulnerability to China by basically delinking a bit. So there is a logic of delinking that is part of great power politics, I would say. But I have not seen that governments in Europe applying that logic of delinking to American finance. They apply it to industrial goods. They apply it to energy. Well, at least there seems to be an attempt to think about energy sovereignty, not just in the context of the climate transition. But I would say particularly for Europe, the situation or the politics is complicated because for a while now, Europe has bought into the American narrative that China's successful gaming of the US international economic order, because this is how I would describe what has happened over the whiny hegemon. The hegemon is whining in some ways because China has proven very adept at gaming the system that the US set up for it to benefit its own corporations internationally. And they didn't expect China to be able to do that. China succeeded, and now they want, I think, all the transformative tariffs they want to do internationally is to achieve what the Biden administration failed to do, which is to roll back China's threat to American hegemony. Now, is that going to entail at some point a more decisive break with American financing? At the moment, it seems to me quite the opposite, that the US is trying to, let's say, renationalize American finance, because J.D. Vance and some parts of the Republican base and the Republican elite have, and you could hear Scott Bessent saying that every now and then, they have bought into, or they believe, at least publicly, a story of the US dollar as the reserve currency has not given, as we generally tend to think, has not given an exorbitant privilege to the United States as an issuer, but it has come with significant costs. And they sometimes use words like financialization, which is very bizarre because we used to think it's a leftist term for denouncing the power of big finance, but they use the words financialization. And every now and then they would say stuff like capital controls, which is a form of renationalizing some bits of American finance under the idea that transformative tariffs cannot work and domestic manufacturing cannot basically re-emerge or blossom without some way of both preventing surplus countries from accumulating US dollar assets, but also preventing American finance from moving freely in and out and appreciating the US dollar, or creating patterns of a strong currency that go against the reindustrialization project. So that is a more interesting tension that I think, I mean, my view is that the power politics of the Trump project will never go as far as imposing capital controls, but I may be wrong. And I may underestimate the historical contingencies and the historical moment we are in which maybe significant dislocations are possible. I haven't seen that many dislocations yet that are very significant, but you are expecting more significant dislocations than I am.
No, it's not so much that I certainly have no inside information about it, but it seems that even if the J.D. Vance fantasies don't come through in the immediate future, the very possibility that they could, which you yourself raise, might also cross the mind of other governments. And so therefore you don't want to be waiting for it to happen or not happen for sure before you take measures. So it's in that perspective, I mean, we discussed yesterday the new plan of Spain, for instance, which you saw as a very classical form of de-risking. However, part of it is about being kind of more friendly to Chinese investment. So that is a step. I'm not saying it's a step necessarily in the right direction. It's not like I'm a Chinese enthusiast, but in terms of the diversification or the way of sort of warding off the possibility of these capital control fantasies coming through, that can trigger motion. And when motions are triggered, then who knows where they stop and where they lead.
You're right. I would say if I mean, inviting or courting Chinese investment, even the Trump administration, I think, might be contemplating that, because the way that I understand, you could say the Trump administration is in its relationship with China is replaying the American anxieties about the Japanese threat to American hegemony from the 1980s and the 1990s in the car industry and bigger. And the way that they resolve that in some ways is to get Japanese cars to car companies to go and invest in the US, and Europe could have a version of that, as in to say, okay, maybe we have now fallen behind with our clean tech technologies, with our ability to produce the very technological end of like new industries. The way is to ask for what the new international economic order countries in the global south asked for 50 years ago, which is technology transfers, right? So you could say, well, European countries could say, let's kind of enter some more benign regional, or not regional, but US excluding coalition of the willing, in which we have a fairer distribution of capacity to produce and a fairer distribution of consumption, right? Because that's one of the things that everybody levels at China, is that it doesn't encourage sufficient domestic consumption because it prioritizes export-led growth. It is a possibility. It is a kind of a more benign scenario than the one that China hawks are pushing both in Europe and in the US, in which the European Union becomes increasingly incensed with the fact that if China cannot export to the US, it's going to flood with its overcapacity European markets even more. I think I don't particularly buy the argument about overcapacity, because in some ways it suggests that there is some kind of equilibrium capacity that is given by the market, and industrial policies or by themselves and in themselves wrong or market distorting. That is a possible scenario. The more intriguing scenario for the Wall Street consensus is it possible for European countries to try to win themselves off American finance one way or another, and the dominance of American finance in both what we call traditional asset management and the growing dominance of American private equity firms in housing in Spain, in data infrastructure in the United Kingdom, or in continental Europe. And there again, I go back to the logic of the Investability Pact. This has been built over decades in order to resolve the divorce between monetary and fiscal policy, and the terms of that divorce are still here with us today. And I don't see how kicking out a large source of demand for your sovereign debt and for your corporate debt is within the political horizon of European elites.
Okay. Maybe not.
Maybe not yet. They tried a weaker version of this when they tried to discipline BlackRock into investing less in coal companies, and that project failed for a variety of reasons.
No,
but
I mean,
the conditions change.
Yes,
historical conditions
it would
change.
It would depend on the emergence of political forces in Europe that would call for that, right?
Yes.